I'll tell you a little bit about the where this came from. I always like to tell people, especially of the research community, where things came from, not just what it is. During the day, I work at Google Cloud. My team builds custom AI models for some of our largest customers. These are usually the hairiest problems. These are usually the ones that require the most amount of background research, that sort of thing. And then at night, I teach at Columbia University. I researched and taught 2 classes. One was called Digital Transformation and Disruption, where instead of looking at the best practices of companies like, that you've probably read in every major publication, I actually looked at thousands of dead companies. Why? Because there's way more data on dead companies than alive ones. But 2, I think it's under-researched. And that became a class. And then I teach the AI class, which is not a coding class, but it is for mid-level professionals, middle managers, and executives on what they can expect, what they should worry about, and what they shouldn't worry about, essentially where that comes from. So that keeps me kind of busy, but I've had the pleasure of the last year or so being sent at considerable Google's expense all over the world to talk to CIOs, CTOs, and their research and development teams about what they're doing with generative AI specifically. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But of course, in the academic fashion, I'll give you a disclaimer. Yes, I do have personal financial interest in all the companies that I talk about. I also invest in almost all of their competitors too. So am I compromised? Yes, but I am evenly compromised, is what I like to jokingly say. Sure, I do think that I'm bigger, I'm more of a bull when it comes to the technology as opposed to any individual company. I think there's a lot of focus on competition. The fact is that the research, the need, and the ability to deliver is all kind of coming together nicely now. And so I'm big on the space in general, which is I'm not gonna lie, it's a very fun space to be in right now. So I'll do a little interactive part here. Raise your hand if you've seen or heard these phrases or similar in your research or in your projects at work. You ready? All right. 1, haggling over precise wording. How many of you have seen this? Haggling over, okay, good, solid 40% of you. Okay, revisiting previously made decisions. Okay, like 70%, is that right? I got that? Okay, last one, multiple copies of the same files. Again, solid 80%. Okay, that is probably what defines a lot of modern work. Our jobs are now becoming plagued with these problems, and they're not new problems. I can prove they're not new problems because these are the things that are listed in a document from 1943, written by an organization known as the Office of Strategic Services. The Office of Strategic Services later became known as the CIA. They listed these functions, these issues, in their field sabotage manual. I'm serious. They actually say if you want to destroy an organization from the inside, you should do the very things that we all just raised our hands about. It's pretty terrifying. You can actually get this on eBay, by the way. The simple sabotage field manual by what would become the CIA. This was actually kind of terrifying. I love reading old government documents. I find them fascinating. It gives you a view into their ideology. But what's pretty wild here is that when I read it, and it's at the very end, it basically says if you're behind enemy lines and they somehow manage to employ you, do all those things and then they'll become ineffective, is actually what they say. Which is pretty terrifying if you think about it, right? Our norm is now considered sabotage. Like, I don't like this. I love seeing effective organizations. I love the idea of knowledge flowing to the right people at the right time. And I actually argue is that AI is actually helping reverse this trend from sabotage to normal, back to, let's just call it what it is, sabotage. I think generative AI is actually one of the few technologies that's actually gets the distinction of saying it's one of the most powerful technologies since the internet. That's a pretty wild statement. I don't misunderstand how obnoxious that statement is. But I haven't seen a technology since the internet that has affected governments, process, legal departments, marketing departments, financial projections, has affected media, content, all simultaneously with the same technology, pretty much since the internet. Argument might be databases, which is a pretty bold claim too, right? The generative AI stuff is definitely in its infancy, and it is not perfect. But the potential applications are pretty wild. And I think for anyone who works, and people often ask me, what's a good indicator of an organization that can benefit from Gen AI? And I basically say, do you have documents? Okay, it's applicable. And that's the litmus test, right? And it's pretty wild because I'll show you some of the examples of how it's affecting project management, but there's no single industry, there's no single sector, there's no single country that is exempt from this, it seems. And we're acutely aware in the research community and in the corporate community about this. And that's why I think I'll show you some of the things that I'm reading in the news and that I'm seeing in reality and how they're not quite lining up. So quickly, how did we get here? How many of you think you could reasonably describe how a large language model works? That's normal. Okay, 3, 4. That's fair. Honestly, I'd say it's so new and it's pretty well. But to totally oversimplify it, here's what we did. We figured out how to build, the researchers figured out how to build this thing called transformer technology, and they built these transformers, and it worked okay. It worked in theory. It worked in the lab, if you will. And then they put absurd amounts of data to it. I mean, like petabytes, right? Many. And they threw it, and it was like okay until it started getting great. It kind of went up like a hockey stick curve. And then the results started getting good. It started being believable. Like, oh, that's actually well written. That's indistinguishable from human writing, right? Like, that was really good. But it did take absurd amounts of data. And I love this quote. It says, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." We had to bring data to prove the data was enough data, and that was our data. Like, it was getting a bit weird for a while there. So if you ever feel like the generative AI community is sort of building the plane while it's flying, that's not wrong. And I'd actually employ, and I hate to say this, but I don't think critical thinking is on the rise. I think it's on the decline, and that's a problem. So whenever you're like, I have questions, ask those questions. They're fair. You might not get a good answer, to be honest, but I think it's fair to ask these questions. And some of the smartest executives and the smartest researchers I've seen are asking questions, being like, why can't we do this? Or what's it not good at, right? And we know AI is terrible at really 2 things, and that's sarcasm and humor in general. It doesn't, when it gets funny, like truly funny, I will believe that it's really there. But right now, we're not there yet. But I do say, ask for data, comparing models and things like that is not a bad thing, right? You're going to want to switch them out all the time, but I think it's actually pretty important to know is that not everything is known and discovered yet. It is still early days, despite some of the confidence in some of the researchers and products out there. So what are the ingredients? One of the trends that I've sort of noticed in the generative AI world is that they have large amounts of data. Most organizations do have large amounts of data. That's great, love that. But do they have historical data? And not just the positives, but the negatives. So for example, if you're trying to build something that's going to validate some research or do a meta study or something like that, have you seen all the models of where look at all the research papers that didn't line up? That's actually just as valuable in this world. And I think historically a lot of organizations have thrown away the negatives and only kept the positives, saying, hey, you need to have a golden truth. This is it. I'm like, what about all the golden false? And that's actually something to consider. So when you talk about historical data, ask about the negative, and if you have it, because it just makes it better. So not knowing what you definitely don't do is really helpful when you're trying to figure out what you do, right? One of the big trends I've noticed is the focus on consumer-grade tools. And I want to be clear, these are interesting, but one of the things that happened in the IT industry, you may remember around last year, you heard about generative AI data leaks or something along those lines. Let me explain how this happens. It's not a technical problem at all. It's a policy problem. And the reason we know this is because a lot of organizations right out the gate just said they banned ChatGPT, they banned all large language models, they banned generative AI. It was scary. They didn't know what to do with it. They didn't have any policies, so just the answer is no. So the most innovative and most ambitious employees took company or organizational data, they took it outside the organization, and they uploaded it to a consumer tool, creating the very leak they were trying to prevent, right? This was a policy problem, not a technology problem. It's not an oil-filled engine, right? It's software, right? When a leak happens, it's because of human behavior, typically involving technology, yes, but not directly from it. And that was interesting. Columbia University banned all generative AI tools. I was horrified. Because my students, the students were way ahead of the university, by the way, right? And they were like, can I use this? And I knew some of them were already, by the way. It was pretty obvious. And they asked me, can I use ChatGPT or whatever to do my assignments? And I said, sure, yeah, you can do that. That's fine. Under two conditions. One, you take responsibility for what it says. You don't get to blame OpenAI for your bad, your fake citation or whatever, right? And two is you share the prompt you used. And this is purely self-interested of me. Why? I can tell who gets it just by the prompt. If I read the prompt, they go, oh, he gets it. Don't need to read it. It's fine. He had the nuance that goes into the prompt is really important. So kind of interesting is that when you go from consumer grade to enterprise grade, you get to do all sorts of interesting stuff, like put your data on top of it, and it gets smarter. So you're worried about hallucinations in the AI world, is what they call them, which is hilarious. Is basically not enough data on the thing that you wanted answers on. So if your organization provides data, you can do that. And we're seeing the most valuable use cases are using enterprise-grade tools. They're spending the money to do a little extra up-training of these models. So don't rely on itself just by itself. Rely on it with your context, and that's what makes these things really valuable. I would argue the entire IT world is shifting towards being like, oh, I can create a sort of always-on brain of my data and then control who has access to what. I'll give you one example that's different between the consumer and enterprise world. A CTO of a major Silicon Valley firm messaged me on the day we released our first model. This is at Google. And he said, this is trash. I was like, sweet, love getting that message. And he said, I'm getting different answers to the same question than my coworker is. He was really mad about it on the little chatbot. And I was like, okay, you're the CTO, right? He's like, yeah. I'm like, you have access to pretty much every document you could ever want on your corporate system, right? He's like, yeah. I'm like, does your coworker? He's like, no. I'm like, is his answers always worse than yours? He's like, yeah. I'm like, that's a feature, buddy. You don't want every employee being like, how much does so-and-so make? Or, what are they working on? Can I see all their private files? You don't want that, right? So the security profiles of different employees or members controls the answers. This is not a problem. This is a solution, right? And that means you don't have to have multiple models, right? So it's kind of interesting the way that even the most seasoned professionals just got the concept wrong out the gate, right? And that's the difference between, I think, if you're going to do really good research using large language models, I think looking at enterprise-grade tools is very helpful because it'll solve a bunch of problems out the gate. It's much more secure in general, but that can be amazing. And I've noticed that if you read the press, it's all about the consumer stuff. They're almost unaware of the enterprise world, and all the money is in the enterprise world when it comes to value and profitability or just efficiency, right? Which is pretty wild. I'm now starting to see, for example, one of my research counterparts at Columbia set up an LLC so he could set up an enterprise environment so he could do his own research outside of the university because he was getting better results with that. And then he would feed the results back into the university system afterwards, right? It's like, so people are doing it this kind of decentralized system is actually the only way it seems to be working if you're going to regulate it. The other thing is that these consumer tools tend to pick up steam very quickly. This is a quote from a friend of mine who's he's a product manager on Microsoft Project, okay, which is just a mouthful. But he says, my biggest competitor is Excel. Like, I don't, you can, sure, if you're planning a vacation, Excel's fine. You're doing a major project, you should probably step up to the enterprise grade tools, right? And I've seen multi-billion-dollar projects run off of Excel, which is pretty wild. And that's not a knock on Excel. It's not the intention of Excel either, right? And I know too many of you are smiling right now on that one. But the fact is that I think the consumer grade stuff, good place to start, good place to tinker, but there's a whole bunch of value on the enterprise side. And I don't need to tell a room of professionals working on bigger projects about this. Fun fact, everyone says, oh, is that him? I said, nope, this is actually an AI-generated person that kind of looks like him. I used a website called thispersondoesnotexist.com. So if you ever need a photo of someone and you don't want to worry about like licensing or rights or, just go to thispersondoesnotexist.com and use it. It's kind of fun. All right, so other patterns that I've seen, AI tends to work better in larger organizations, not smaller. This is the opposite of what we've seen in the past 20, 30 years in the technology sector. It's like they tend to be smaller is nimble. Larger organizations have more data and they tend to be a little more organized. They have their access and security stuff set up. They tend to have more data and hopefully fewer silos, but not necessarily. And this is my favorite one. Employees are such better behaved users than the open web. Why? Because they might get fired, right? That's pretty obvious. So what happens is basically the data they produce is cleaner. The data they produce is less likely to be spammy, hacky, spoofy, whatever fun internet term you want to use. And that means the models perform better. So it's like you collected better data faster with less problems. And that's what works on the enterprise, which is pretty interesting. Okay, in the interest of time, I'll talk about how this is affecting the world of project management because it seems to have a lot of minor effects. If you think there's going to be an AI that just manages projects, probably not. You're going to be disappointed. I'll tell you that much. But it will affect it in a number of different small ways. My buddy, Dr. Ed Hoffman, which has, by the way, this is the best job title I've ever heard. He was the chief knowledge officer at NASA. I'm the smart guy for smart guys. Like, that's such an awesome title, right? I never let him forget it, right? And he's an awesome guy. He teaches at Columbia, and he basically, I showed him and all the knowledge management professionals in the faculty, I showed them a demo of how you could take organizational data, put it on top of a large language model, and ask it questions. And what we did was we took all the research that went into in 1986, the Challenger explosion, like terrifying, horrible thing. Well, we took all the data that was available up until launch day, and we put it on top of a large language model. And then we asked it, should you launch? And it said no. It's like, oh, we did not have this technology in 1986, I just want to be clear. But I was like, look, theoretically, if you have all the parts that are going to a space shuttle, which is millions, right? You have all the technical specs associated with it, and you know that they have certain temperature ranges. And if you're not familiar, it was a temperature range problem. It was too cold, and they should have launched that day because it was too cold, and that's why they had the problems they had. But the fact was, this large language model in about 3 seconds could go through all of those millions of documents and go, oh, no, that's a critical piece, and that is, it's way too cold to launch that, no launch. And it's like, well, that's kind of helpful. That doesn't replace a launch director. It makes them better, though. Like, that could have saved lives, and I think it already is starting to save lives. So 4 main areas of project management that I think that will be affected. Financial, this is mostly around prediction of financial, using the more accurate prediction methodologies. Planning and execution, I think, is pretty straight. Asset management is pretty good because people don't know actually what they're managing in a lot of cases. And my personal favorite, knowledge management. When we showed that demo to those faculty members at Columbia in the knowledge management program, and let's be clear, sometimes academics can be a bit stuffy about things and a little not open-minded as they should be. And I hate that about academia. I think we need to be more open-minded and entertain wild ideas because some of them are right. Most of them are not, let's be clear. But some of them are, and the cost of not entertaining them is quite high, I think. But the fact was, when I showed them this, they got so excited because I showed them the technology that was going to execute on the theory that they had been talking about for 30 years. Like, oh, we're gonna get the right information to the right person at the right time. And I was like, great, I know who, I know what, I know when, I can send it in a chatbot message, I can send it in an email, I can send it in a pop-up notification, however you want. That's fine. We just use 2 different versions of AI, put them together, and now it's like you're going to have a meeting with X. Here's the background on that person. Or, for example, you're a customer service agent. Here's the summary of the last call that they came in about. So at least you have context, right? This stuff makes people more efficient. It makes them better, and we've seen mostly, especially in the customer service kind of era, it makes them happier, both customers and employees, because they can do their jobs effectively, right? Reading a transcript is not your value. It needs to be done, but it's not your value. In the planning space, one of my favorite kind of reports that comes out in the AI world is calculating risk. That's really what we do in project management, is a lot of risk calculation. Just bet. It's a little bit of casino methodology there, right? We're placing our bets, right? Well, that's risky, that's not, let's go here. I think we can actually do a lot better with AI when it comes to the variance of certain types of tasks have very little variance. They might be very risky, but there's little variance in that. And other ones have wide variance, right? It's like, well, we can just know that and have that context. I think that's really helpful. Complexity scoring and the explainability of this stuff. I found this weird pattern where data scientists are building incredibly wild AI models. And they get this output, it looks like this is called feature importance, by the way. And feature importance essentially is one way of saying, hey, here's the explainability of why the model did what it did, right? So when people say, oh, it's a black box, we don't know why, I just point to this chart and go, we do. It's just complex, you know? And we basically know that certain things drive certain things. That makes sense. So we show this, and I've shown this to, for example, executives who have nothing to do with the day-to-day operations of their businesses. And they basically say, hey, by the way, the price that you're charging, what percentage of that is the cost of fuel? Or what percentage of that is the cost of labor? Or just this specific labor type? Right? And he'll like kind of ballpark it. I'm like, no, you should know every day to the, at least a couple decimal points what it is. And he goes, that's not possible. And I show them how we can do this. And they're like, so these data science things are not, the data scientists don't know what's valuable to their boss's boss. And the bosses have no idea what to ask for. They're just completely like it's not in their world. And I think actually project management is actually a very good vehicle between the two, because guess what? If you have a big project, you're going to be talking to someone pretty important sooner or later, right? If you're doing things right or wrong. And then dependency risk scoring. We can actually say, hey, like, by the way, here's the cascading effect of this stuff. This one, it seems simple, but it's actually really critical later, and it might be 4 steps down the road. We tend to see things in like a waterfall pattern, and that's helpful for some organization, but not all. The knowledge management piece, I think all status reports should be automatically generated and just reviewed. We do this, Google does this, I started doing this with my readings at Columbia. It's basically saying, hey, here's the latest, here's the status of this thing, and you can ask it, and I don't have to answer messages anymore. It's great. Less email is generally good in my life. QBRs, or quarterly business reviews, which are very common in the private sector, should be done and finished in a matter of minutes and just reviewed for accuracy. I think that's entirely possible. Your project history and lessons learned. Lessons learned. This is gold for a large language model. Hey, here's what we did. Here's what went right. Here's what went wrong. Like, why not? Like, this is stuff, by the way, that's not just good for the organization. It's critical for new people to the organization. Like, everyone knows, for example, in the software development world, there's always the guy who comes in and a week later he breaks the whole product, right? Because he didn't know about something, some little thing. This is the stuff we should provide to employees, new researchers, new faculty, whatever, right off the bat. Why? Tell me all the things that we've done and what we got right and what we got wrong, and I will be a better employee by default having read that, right? Like, why not? This isn't standard practice, and it should be. Asset management, one of the most important use cases I've been working on is staffing. This could be for airlines, this could be for hospitals, this could be for train yards, whatever. But the fact is, getting the right person on the right shift, on the right day, on the right time of year is really important, especially for mission critical stuff. Like, you gotta have a crew on an airplane, you gotta have a captain, you gotta have a first officer. You can't necessarily mix them around. Like sometimes, like first officer can be a captain, but flight attendant can't be a captain. The captain isn't going to do the flight attendant role from my conversations with them. But we can actually get really good at predicting who's going to show up. Like, for example, we know that certain types of employees just don't show up after the Super Bowl. They don't show up the next day, they call in sick. It's like, well, we know why. Not all of them, but we know a certain percentage almost always will every year, right? Like, can we predict that? Yes. Should we predict that? Yes, right? Because when you run a hospital or an airline or whatever, you kind of need people on staff. You can't just say, oh, like people called in sick. Where do they go when they're sick? The hospital, Skill set discovery, one thing we find is that, how about this? Let me ask you this. How many of you think your job title describes everything you know really well? Okay, so we can all agree that this is kind of weird. There's talent in every single organization, whether it's public sector, private sector, that is available and knowable, but is not described in people's job titles. This is good for these organizations. This is good for efficiency, and it's good for employees, right? Everyone's got their thing. They're like, I just generally like this. I got really good advice when I was 19 years old. Someone told me, get really good at something everyone else hates. That's how I got into search technology, by the way, is that it was just considered boring, right? And I was like, I think it's cool, right? And it turned out to be really good advice. All of you have something like that, and it has not been properly communicated to the people around you that might need it. Dealing with procurement teams and RFPs, requests for proposals. By the way, Google's statements of work that we do for custom work, it's all written by large language models and then reviewed by an expert. Right? We don't send there typing anymore. We just go bloop and just describe a little bit, and it punches out 3-4 page documents saying what we're going to do. And we say yes, yes, no, and we send the feedback. So it gets better and better and better at writing these things, because the value is not in writing. The value is not in hitting the keyboard. The value is in the thought process that went into what hit the keyboard. Right? And the last one I'll talk about, financial management. One thing I love seeing in the AI world is this trend where people say, oh, we have these forecasts. I'm like, well, what's included in the forecast? They're like, oh, historical data, current information. And then I say, what would you love to see in that forecast? And they're like, well, there's everything from weather to financial forecast. Macroeconomic data is a big one. I want to know, is if inflation up, that's going to affect a number of different things in my business, right? And we can do those forecasts now better and better, because they are more and more complex. But AI is really good at handling really complex stuff, right? As long as it's data, right? The what-if scenario planning, the Department of Defense in the US has been arguably one of the best organizations on earth about this. I don't think there's a single scenario they haven't considered. They know it's very unlikely, but they'll say, like a total engineer, they'll say, there's a non-zero chance, right? So every single scenario they can imagine they've got a plan for. Up-to-date predictions. How many of you have gone into a meeting, made a decision in the meeting, only to get the critical data after the meeting? We need to end this. It's getting the number of times that the decision's made. I'm like, that's not how good decision making works. You just reverse it, right? I think we can do update, like the 5 minutes before the meeting, let's update the numbers. There you go, much better, right? All right, I'll finish on these couple things, is that one, I think people get very nervous. I talk to a lot of, especially executives, they get very nervous about AI. They want to do it, they think they should do it, and they're terrified to do it, right? I've seen a little bit in this, same thing in the academic world. When I told my students that they could use generative AI, I was like, go ahead, let's have fun, you know? But the fact is that I knew that the value of an assignment does not come from fingers hitting keyboards. It's not, I don't work in the depressed finger or keyboard industry, right? But it was like, do they get it? Do they get to understand it? Can they repeat it back in their own words and it still makes sense? That's the value. If they get that right, I reevaluate. I said, I don't really care who hits the keyboard. I don't care, right? If you have your friend do it, if you do the voice-to-text translation, it doesn't change it, right? And I think it's a real value. What's valuable and what's not? And I think as we get more and more advanced in AI, we'll see a concept called convergence. And convergence is basically AI models will start ingesting AI model data, outputs. And it'll actually get more narrow and accurate, but it will become less and less creative. Guess where you guys come in? Being a little more creative, right? And that's not a bad thing. I think actually being outside of the norm and seeing a pattern that no one else can see, or knowing something that isn't structured data is very, very valuable, like human relationships, for example. Like people knowing, like, oh, that's my brother-in-law. Of course he got included on the RFP. Like, okay, like that could not have known that, right? But I think reevaluating your tasks to say, hey, what is actually valuable and what is structured that can be done by a machine is not a bad thing. In fact, most people that have this happen to them, they're much happier in their jobs, which is interesting. I thought it would be the opposite, right? The risks are real. I'm not a total optimist. I've seen things go wrong. Be very, very careful about this. AI does not always get it right. That's why we need humans in the loop. AKA, you gotta say, yes, thumbs up, that was good. Thumbs down, that was bad. Every time you don't give feedback, you're ceding the future to something else, right? So I actually think that humans are the answer here, and that's why I think there will not be such a catastrophic loss that a lot of people are predicting, right? I think it'll actually be a change in jobs. Tasks will change, jobs likely will not. So I'll close with this. No, Gen AI probably won't take your job, but someone using it might. I think that's a fair statement. I've seen some developers that are just coming out of university right now, and they can write 10 times the amount of code as some of the best performers. Why? They know how to tune a model to write code the way that they would want, than as opposed to writing code to tune a model, right? So think about it like that. Adopting this technology, whichever technology you use, I think you'll become a more efficient and generally less toilsome employee. One pattern I've noticed that no one seems to talk about, and this is actually a quote from Futurama. I feel like this room's probably friendly to Futurama, is when you do AI right, people won't know you've done anything at all. The best AI systems don't announce themselves as AI. It just works better and faster. That's it. It's almost like it just kind of floats under the radar, right? And so you say like, oh, are we using AI for this? Or it's an AI. Honestly, that's usually not the big value or big impactful system. It's usually the one that just kind of solved the problem that no one wanted to deal with anymore. Right? And they're like, oh, this is annoying. And then it just kind of automates it quietly in the background, and everyone's better off for it, and it doesn't announce itself. It's very humble in that way. And I don't think that's a bad thing. All right, in closing, one, I think take the data seriously. Collect data on yourself, collect data for your organization, structure it properly. The best people in AI, at least in the private sector, their bonus is not dependent on how well the AI works. It's dependent on how good the data going into it is. So I've seen people pay, I've seen a data engineering team where they're like, we'll give you $50,000 at the end of the year if you get 99% accuracy on your training data, not the output, right? Because it solves itself. You solve the in problem, you solve the out problem, right? So that's pretty clear if that's possible. Understand enterprise, or at least pro tools versus consumer tools. The consumer tools are okay. The pro tools, like if you can get over the technological hurdle, it's pretty wild what they can do. And then, of course, plan for change. I think the best thing you can do in a rapid technologically changing environment, let's be clear, we are right in the middle of one right now, is to be open-minded and continuously learn. When I hear someone say, I've been doing this for 20, 30, whatever years, I start to cringe a little bit. I know that had a lot of value, and it still has some value, but the fact is being able to change now is a better skill than having done something for 20 years, right? So you can say, I've been doing Gen AI for 10 years in 10 years. Sure, go ahead, right? With that, I think if we get good at this, we have a reasonable expectation of the technology and take data seriously, I think we can seriously stop self-sabotaging ourselves, right? Because I think it's pretty bad out there. So with that, my name is Ben Royce. Thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate it. I'll be around all afternoon. Thank you.